I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Welcome to a conversation with Cal's 1986 Alumnus of the Year, John Kenneth Galbraith. PhD in Agricultural Economics from Berkeley, 1934. Professor of Economics for more than 50 years. Writer, author of more than 20 books, including The New Industrial State and The Affluent Society, one novel, The Triumph, Price Czar during World War II, a project director in the strategic bombing studies after World War II, editor at Fortune magazine, advisor to President Kennedy, U.S. ambassador to India during the Kennedy administration, a leader in the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War, past president of the American Economics Association. Professor Galbraith, welcome back to Berkeley.
Well, it's very nice to be back.
What are your fondest memories of the campus when you were here in the 30s?
Oh, there would be no doubt about that, but my fondest memories are of the surroundings, the ambience. As I'm saying in my speech this evening, it's always assumed that academic study must be under, depraved conditions, otherwise it has no real effect. And my memory of Berkeley in those years is of the, supreme beauty of this setting, but also of a range of professors who were enormously close to the students and who also had a kind of built-in dissonance, a will to be inconvenient, a desire to afflict the comfortable, which I think had a certain and I hope good effect on a whole generation of graduate students in economics, students generally.
What would you say is Berkeley's most distinctive contribution in shaping the style and the ideas of John Kenneth Galbraith?
I would say, I would hope that it was a certain tendency to question the official wisdom, what I later called the conventional wisdom, one of the few phrases for which I can rightly or wrongly take some responsibility.
And are you saying that Berkeley was a hotbed of radicalism in those days, or was it more that it left you with an inquiring mind?
Well, I would hope it was both. This was I was here during the years of the Great Depression, when nobody could say that the economic system was working with great precision and great compassionate effect. And there was certainly a strong, possibly romantic movement to the left during those times. I looked on this with some jealousy, as a matter of fact, and would like to have joined it, but I was in agricultural economics and I was fresh from studying agriculture, so I had a sense that I was not the right material for this highly sophisticated movement. Also, as I've said many times, secretly I was enjoying the system. And while I never admitted that to any of my colleagues, I think this kept me on perhaps an unfortunate avenue of respectability. On the other hand, no one could be at Berkeley in those years and be just a passive recipient of what I earlier called the conventional wisdom.
And when you were here as a student, you did a lot of field work in agriculture. I recall reading that you would go out and check on the status of various products and so on. Is that?
No, that's not quite true, but I was a research assistant in the Giannini Foundation, and we were expected to earn our pay, which in my case was $720 a year, $60 a month. And I earned my pay as an assistant to a very genial man by the name of Edwin Voorhees. I earned my pay joining with him in a statewide study of the beekeeping industry. I think I can honestly say that I am the author of the polar work on beekeeping in California. I hope nobody in our audience will take that as a commercial.
That's right. No, well, we pride ourselves on not having commercials, so
Good.
That's good. In your autobiography, A Life in Our Times, you wrote that agricultural economics left me with a strong feeling that social science should be tested by its usefulness.
Well, there was at that time two streams of, and still, two streams of economic thought. There was what Thorstein Veblen, who until a few years before I came to Berkeley was at Stanford, what Thorstein Veblen called, well, I have to correct myself, it was quite a few years before I came to Berkeley that he was at Stanford. He called exoteric knowledge, which is knowledge related to practical application, as, for example, the greater prosperity of the beekeepers. That was certainly exoteric. Then Veblen identified a more prestigious line of work in the social sciences and in other subjects, which he called esoteric, which prided itself on having no practical use of any kind, totally remote from anything having to do with what we would now call policy and economics, public policy. And I always felt that although the prestige still lies with esoteric activity in a university, that probably the exoteric are more useful.
Is that why you spent much of your writing time working on problems of power in economics?
Partly, yes. There are two things that people pursue in life, not wholly unrelated. One is money, and the other is power. And we see this and take it for granted in the attraction of power. We take for granted in politics in your field, where people spend tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and now millions of dollars in order to have positions in Washington or Sacramento or wherever where they have power. But in economics, classical and neoclassical economics, that has no particular role. The thrust there is for pecuniary return, for money. And I've always felt and still feel very strongly that denies in the economic world a very large part of the motivation. That people want to be head of General Motors or General Electric or General Mills or another of the other, what shall we say, generals. They want those jobs, certainly for the income that is returned, but that the income is itself a measure of the prestige and power, authority that goes with achieving those positions. And so I have tried in some of my writing, how successfully I don't know, to bring power back into a role in economic motivation. I gave us an address some years ago, which has been quite widely reproduced, and I was my presidential address at the American Economics Association. I called Power and the Useful Economist. That one is not useful in economics unless one brings the thrust for power into appreciation, consideration.
If one were to attempt to characterize your work, it's really political economy. And what I want to ask you is, why isn't there really a political economy tradition in our great universities?
Well, I wouldn't be so hard as that. There is. There was all, and perhaps is weaker now than it once was. But places like Wisconsin, University of Texas, to a substantial extent at certain times at Harvard, John D. Black, Alvin Hansen, there and here at California, there was a strong tradition of people who were concerned with the political side of the subject. And indeed, that had the implication of a concern for power. I tried to bring power into more theoretical terms than some of them did. So I wouldn't be so harsh as to say this wasn't part of the American tradition. It's much more part of the American tradition, I should think, than the British tradition.
But was there a waning in recent times, with the exception of your work? I mean...
Well, this is one of the dangers of age, that you to some extent, look down and see homogeneity where among younger people, where when you're younger, you look up and see enormous diversity among older people. It's one of the dangers of listening too carefully to anybody of my age. But having said that, and having admitted the likelihood of being wrong, I do think that these last years, certainly the last 20 years, have brought a strong shift back to what I've called the esoteric aspects of economics, to mathematical expressions in economics, econometric niceties, and a tendency to leave the real world alone. It's something that in Cambridge we call the Belmont syndrome. The Belmont is an extremely comfortable suburb adjoining Cambridge, and the Belmont syndrome is the desire to move from a peaceful, happy life in Belmont to a peaceful, happy life at Harvard, from wife to computer and back again, without any disturbance from Ronald Reagan.
That's I see. When one looks at the corpus of your work, it's quite clear that good writing, lucid, clear, precise, is very important to your various vocations that you have held. I mean, that in a way you are primarily a writer. I wanted to ask you first, what do you think it takes to be a good writer?
Well, I can only speak, I hope you're right. Certainly, I've certainly been part of my aim in life. It certainly took service under a good editor at one time. I was an editor of fortune under Harry Luce, the founder of Time, Inc., who was one of the most ruthless editors I have ever known, and anyone has ever known. Harry could look over a sheet of copy and say, this can go, and this can go, and this can go, and you'd be left with 8, 10 lines, which said everything you'd said in 20 lines before. And this, I can still, to this day, not write a page without the feeling that Harry Luce is looking over my shoulder and saying, that can go. One extraordinary part of good writing is to avoid excess, which many writers do not understand. The next thing, which of course is obvious, is to be aware of the music, the symphony of words, and to make written expression acceptable to the ear. How successfully and how one does that, I don't know, but it certainly is something that has always been a concern of mine. I worked on it very hard first in one of my first widely read books, The Great Crash of 1929. And I was enormously pleased when it was so reviewed. The Great Crash is an ambiguous title, I must say. One should always watch titles. I've told this many times. I looked once to see if a copy was in the LaGuardia Airport bookstore in New York, and the lady there said, "That's not a title you could sell in an airport." It's a great crime. The third thing is, which I think to be perhaps in some ways, well, the third thing I'll come to a fourth later. The third is never to assume that your first draft is right. The first draft when you're writing involves the terrible problem of thought combined with the terrible problem of composition. And it is only in the second and third and fourth drafts that you really escape that original pain and have the opportunity to get it right. Again, I'm repeating myself. I've said many times that I do not put that note of spontaneity that my critics like into anything but the fifth draft. It may have a slightly artificial sound as a consequence of that. The final thing is in economics is to have one great truth always in mind. That is that there are no propositions in economics that can't be stated in clear, plain language. There just aren't.
In an essay that you wrote about writing on the occasion of turning down, I guess, a visiting position in rhetoric here at Berkeley, you commented on the use of humor. And I want to read you what you said and ask you how it applies to Galbraith. You wrote, "Recognize the grave risks in a resort to humor. Avoid humor. Nothing so undermines a point as its association with a wisecrack."
Well, this was an ironical comment. There's no question that in all writing, humor is a very delicate instrument. It fades over into obviousness, absurdity very quickly. And you'll always use it at risk. And secondly, there is no form of irony in the world that won't be taken seriously. I once wrote a piece of which I was at the time very proud. I maybe shouldn't go back and read it again. Somewhat arguing ironically, that socialism in the United States was the result of organized sports. It takes people at a vulnerable age and makes teamwork more than individual work the thing. It subjects people to the authority of the team captain or the coach. And as I say, this is at an age where people are vulnerable, and therefore team sports are the breeding ground for socialism and must be watched very carefully. And I had an organization in the piece that ran in Harper's called the CIA, the Congress for Individualist Athletics. And it was written under a pseudonym because I was then an ambassador. I couldn't write under my own name. One day the postman struggled into my room at Harvard with a pile of letters this thick that had been sent on from Harper's of people who, well, they fell into three classes. People who wanted to know whether it was real or not. People who wanted to join. And people who demanded that I exclude baseball from the list because baseball is not, as they said, a socialist sport. When you are up at the bat, you're on your own. Well, it's an example of the dangers of using irony. Many people are going to, under the best of circumstances, take it seriously. But in any case, that's a rather long answer to a short question. Those would be the four principles, if anybody can remember them, that I would urge on a writer. Probably the one that should be the two that should be most widely urged is one, to go over the drafts endlessly, and two, to have a good editor.
You were somewhat critical of writing in the social sciences, Is that a fair statement?
Oh, sure. There's a lot of the writing in the social sciences is bad writing, is unnecessarily obscure. A lot of it is designed to give the impression that the individual so writing has a level of sophistication which separates him from the masses and possibly separates him from his colleagues. And quite a bit of it is just unnecessarily verbose.
Writing is a way to get at truth. You wrote a novel called The Triumph about our foreign policy. Why did you do that? And do you think it gave you a vehicle to say things you couldn't otherwise say?
Well, I wrote a couple of novels, and looking back, I would say the time when I was writing those novels was perhaps the happiest of my life. You move into this, one of them was not a novel, but a No. Henry type of thing, which took a lot of the related adventures of an individual by the name of Herschel McClanders and put them together. You move into a world of your own creation. You live in that world, and you can also make a point in a novel. You can make a point in fiction. You have the availability of truth in fiction that you do not have in the real world. The Triumph was a novel. Thanks to President Reagan, it has just been reissued. The novel was a novel about Central America, a country vaguely like, it was vaguely like Haiti, some aspects of Haiti, some aspects of the Dominican Republic, some aspects of Nicaragua, more Nicaragua than any of the other two. And an old dictator like Somoza or Trujillo has reached the end of the road, and a middle-of-the-road social democratic government comes into power. And this arouses the alarm of the State Department because there's a Minister of Education who's suspected of being a communist. And this is something like our present fears that Nicaragua is going to export its communism to Texas. A very great fear. The new government is denied aid, denied assistance, denied recognition, or the ambassadors recalled. And then finally that government falls, and things look up. They bring back the old dictator's son, who's a student at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. He's installed in office there. He's given aid. He's given military support. He calls to his support a lot of young officers, and it develops that this bastard has become a communist at the University of Michigan. As I say, there's a certain relevance to this story that President Reagan, not entirely to my delight, has caused the publisher to reissue the novel after some 16 years. I couldn't be more pleased. Well, I couldn't be pleased with the circumstance that brings it about.
In the early 70s, you wrote an article in Foreign Policy. You called our policy in the Third World the great disaster area of U.S. foreign policy. What is your assessment of today? Are we riding tall in the saddle, as Reagan would like us to feel?
Oh, no. But we have a development which is had not been fully understood, which I'm writing about a little at the moment, which was not part of the predictable behavior of this administration, but is in some degree a consequence of it. Going back to my State Department days and before, the one thing of which I've always been persuaded is that the strongest political force in the world, in the third world, is the desire to be independent. No matter how disastrous independence may be, nobody wants to go back to colonial subordination. Look at Uganda. Nobody can possibly say that this has been a happy country in these last 20 years. It was certainly more peaceful and almost certainly more prosperous when it was a British colony. But amidst all those disasters, you never hear anybody suggesting that it go back under colonial guidance. Not that anybody, I think, would want it. And this desire for this pressure for independence is something to which both the Soviet Union and ourselves are subject. It cost the Soviet Union China, the relationship with China, with the North African countries, Egypt, Algeria, divorced themselves from their and Ghana from their association with the Russians. It's the terrible problem of the Russians in Eastern Europe, not to mention Afghanistan. And similarly, there is the great desire of countries on our side of the Iron Curtain to assert their independence of American influence, to show that they are not pawns of American policy. Well, these last years, if I might, can I continue this lecture for a minute?
Please.
It used to be said that a Harvard professor can't make any point in less than 55 minutes.
That's right.
In these last years, what have we seen? We have seen dictators, or military dictatorships go out of power in Argentina, in Brazil, Guatemala, now in these last days in Haiti and the Philippines. Previously, an authoritarian government went out of business in Iran. And why did they go out? Why has there been this great resurgence of democracy under Ronald Reagan? Well, it's been one of the consequences of President Reagan's policies. There is naturally in all countries a resentment of dictatorship. But added to that has been the fact that we had our arms partly around some of these people. George Bush, Vice President Bush, cited Marcus, you will remember, as one of the great paragons of democracy. Similarly, we found some possibilities for human rights development under Duvalier in Haiti, surely one of the greatest discoveries of all time. Similarly in Latin America. So what happened? Why was this, have we had this sudden, this series of disasters for dictators? It is because we united in those countries the dislike for dictatorship with the fear of some degree of subordination to the United States from the fact that we had our arms partly around these people. And it was a disaster for all of them. And what we did was unite the adverse reactions to dictatorships with the fear of subordination to the United States, with also some fear of the Reagan administration itself. All those forces came together. And so we have the paradox that an administration which was sympathetic to the dictators turned out to be the greatest supporter of democracy. Now, I don't want to get into politics on this program and suggest that's any reason for voting for Ronald Reagan. But that's, I think, one of the evident historical paradoxes of these last years. And I think, oddly enough, there's some sense of this in Washington, because you notice some tendency in these last days to detach from Pinochet. Or maybe he has recognized that support from the United States is the last thing he needs to stay in power in Chile.
Are we, in the context of what you're saying, are we witnessing a diminishment of this inordinate fear of communism?
In Washington, you mean?
Yes.
I don't think so. I think that the basic situation of the United States is unchanged, that conservatives in Washington fear communism, and liberals in Washington fear being thought soft on communism, and I don't think that's changed.
One gets the sense today that the liberals still have the fear of losing a domino on their watch. To quote from your autobiography, you're talking about President Kennedy here, and you said his words are still with me, referring to the Bay of Pigs and the acceptance of neutral Laos. He said, "You have to realize that I can only afford so many defeats in 1 year." The idea of being, and again in your description of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the notion that electoral loss is a real fear for liberal Democratic politicians when they confront the third world, when they confront communism.
Oh, no question about it, and I wouldn't for a moment be happy about it. I knew the Far East probably somewhat better than my colleagues in the Kennedy administration, and I would never have supported the idea of a communist Indochina or communist Vietnam. I don't think communism is relevant to that stage of economic development. But I was strongly persuaded that this was not something that was within the reach of our power, and that we could mire ourselves there in an impossible situation, because extending our information to that country was an impossible task. And so my basic argument in those days was that Vietnam and Indochina must be returned to the obscurity on the world scene for which God intended them, that they were not of great social, political, economic, or strategic importance to the United States. I don't think I was, in taking that position, I was somewhat successful in avoiding the label of being pro-communist. I always argued that it takes a very precise Washington observer to tell the difference between a communist jungle and a capitalist jungle. Both are irrelevant to the jungles of Vietnam.
Talking about foreign policy, I would like to also talk about leadership. How would you compare Reagan to John F. Kennedy? Some of the rhetoric is the same. Some of the presentability via the media is the same. But there are differences. What are they?
Well, I would say the difference is that they both are very accomplished masters of television. And the importance of television as an instrument of communication, as an instrument of political persuasion, including those ghastly commercials, is one of the great and in some ways devastating facts of our time. The difference is that Kennedy had an instinct for the reality. He stayed with the reality, or tried to, and felt obliged to. President Reagan is our first president out of our greatest theatrical tradition, which is Hollywood. For President Reagan, there's both the script and the reality, and it is the script that he uses. He doesn't feel confined by the reality. He looks at the speech as a script. And then Larry Speaks comes along after he has dealt with the script on television or on radio and corrects him and says, this is what the reality is. Well, we're a theatrically minded people. We prefer the script. It's always more pleasant than the reality. And the president is a master of the script. If I were the president, I would keep Speaks quiet. I would say to Speaks, look, if you're going to a play, if you're in the theater, you don't have to get up after every act and say, this is what Macbeth was really like.
So all the administration lacks is rock music, and they could really be on MTV all day in a way, you're saying. It's part of that whole cultural
I don't think you want to go quite that far, but I do say that that President Reagan is an accomplished master of the script and doesn't, in the manner of somebody out of the theatrical tradition, worry. He isn't appalled when the script improves on the reality.
Because the reality could be cut like a script, I guess, like on the cutting room floor, like the film on the cutting room floor.
Well, that's right. But I think President Kennedy stayed more closely with the reality. Those of us who were variously associated with him hoped he would.
Was he more? He was a Renaissance man, really. I mean, witty and intelligent, and he actually read books. Is that? Oh
yes, indeed. I've said he read books right through the presidency. I remember going in to see him one day when I was back from India, and he handed me a book by Masters on Burma and the revolution in Burma. And he said, you know, this is the best thing that's been written about that. My goodness, I hadn't been even close to any other books on the more obscure history of economic descent in Burma. And I carried it along with me, felt obliged to read it on the airplane going back to India, so I would know as much about that part of the world as the president.
And is I guess the tragedy is the unfulfilled promise.
I have to correct myself, by the way. It was on the book was on the war in Burma.
Well, so the tragedy on the one hand is the unfulfilled promise, but also what he was embedded in a political structure where he couldn't. I mean, was he denied the time, or was he too cautious a politician?
Oh, he was too cautious, no question. Whether too cautious is the word or not, but he was very cautious. And I've said this many times. I think it's a cliche. John F. Kennedy always used less power than he had in dealing with the Congress and dealing with the public. And Lyndon Johnson, in contrast, with a better understanding of power, always used slightly more than he had. Slightly more, including some of the tragic part of his history on Vietnam. If Lyndon Johnson had not had this terrible incubus of Vietnam, he would have be remembered as one of the great social innovating presidents of our time, more so than Kennedy.
Of your generation, who do you think was the greatest political leader that liberalism had?
Oh, Roosevelt, no question.
And what distinguishes him? What stands out in your mind?
What stands out in my mind is that those of us who were young in the Roosevelt administration, and most everybody in that administration was young, had a sense of fealty, a sense of loyalty, which was beyond anything since, and maybe too great. In those days, along with everybody else, had ideas until Roosevelt had spoken, and then I automatically accepted his. And through the whole structure of the New Deal Washington, including the war years, the greatest mark of pride was to be a Roosevelt man. But this was in turn related to the fact that the president had great flexibility of accommodation to the disaster and despair of the Depression years. This was a terrible time, a perilous time in the history of the Republic. And the singular feature of Franklin D. Roosevelt was his pragmatic accommodation to whatever needed to be done. If you ever hear some politicians say, I'm going to adhere strictly to principle, then you should take shelter because you know you're going to suffer. And in contrast, Roosevelt was, in his time, the supreme pragmatist. And one other thing, too, which is of present relevance. He used radio with the same skill that Ronald Reagan uses television. He was a master of that medium of communication, the first.
What about Stevenson?
Oh, Adlai Stevenson, he was one of the most lovable figures one ever encountered in politics. So we loved him, our wives loved him, my wife loved him. He was caught in the circumstances of the time, including the fact that he was up against, as we now recognize, one of the ablest politicians of our time, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was particularly caught by what I mentioned before, the fear of liberals of being thought soft on communism. So Dwight D. Eisenhower could say in the 1952 campaign, "I will go to Korea," where Stevenson, by contrast, said the problem originates in Moscow, and that's where we must, well, we can't do anything about that. And so Ike brought to an end a very unpopular war in Korea. I almost said Vietnam. He brought to an end a very unpopular war in Korea, and on the principle that on a very sound principle, that a bad peace, which that undoubtedly was, is better than a bad war. Eisenhower also had the capacity for being wonderfully clear when he wanted to be, as when he said that, and as when he gave that, really magnificent speech on the military-industrial complex, of which we've been celebrating the 25th anniversary this last January.
Your comment about writing speeches suggests another problem that I want to probe. Academics in government. When are they most useful in government? How are they usefully deployed, do you think?
Oh, I don't think there's any special role. Lawyers, professors, businessmen. I think this is, one of the strengths of the American democracy is that we draw liberally from all professions, from all sources, and I wouldn't assign any special role to academics.
But do you think that
I don't like that word academics, incidentally, to academic people.
Okay, but is there? I mean, when one thinks of the Roosevelt era, one thinks of all of these scholars and social scientists going to Washington, and one has a greater sense of the success of the effort than one did, for example, during the Kennedy period. The whole group, as opposed to one or another individual.
Well, there were academic people that came in with Eisenhower. My next-door neighbor and longtime friend, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, was closely associated, of all people, with Richard Nixon, and there were others. I would be reluctant to single out the New Deal as a particularly strong example of academic participation. There was a great deal of academic participation, but there was a great deal of participation of lawyers. George Wall came in from the law, Adlai Stevenson came in from the law, Harry Hopkins came in from the Roosevelt, from the New York State apparatus, and so forth. What was unique, what was original in that period, was an addressing of the economic problem. A strong attack on the economic problem, the NRA, the AAA, the various work agencies, and so forth. And these naturally attracted economists to Washington. And this was particularly true of the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which was run by economists. But that was the consequence of an administration that was first addressing in a major way an economic problem.
What has happened to the liberal agenda? It wasn't completed. Will it return when this current phase passes, do you think?
Well, I think if it returns, it will return as not as a consequence of its own agenda, but as a consequence of some of the flaws that are evident in President Reagan's economics. This autumn, as we talk, there's going to be a substantial revolt against Reagan, Mr. Reagan's congressmen and senators in the Farm Belt. And if we had, as might be possible, some considerably adverse effects from this euphoria that is now involved, we're now engaged in debt creation, stock market speculation. This would have the same effect, the same prescient effect for the Democrats as Mr. President Coolidge and President Hoover. You must remember that in 1932 and 1933, when Roosevelt won and came to power, the striking feature of the Democrats was that they had no agenda. That was all created after Roosevelt got to Washington, or almost all of it.
Are there any analogies with the present period and the period of the Great Crash that you described in your book?
Well, this is something I've been talking about in recent times. The analogies are hard, should not be easily drawn. I would say there are two things that are parallel that we should worry about. One is now, as in the late 20s, the impression, this is a very subtle but a very important point, the impression that somehow or other, if everything is left to the market, to laissez-faire, if the government keeps its hands off, there is a God-given tendency for things to work out. Laissez-faire, laissez-passer, that this is a ruling fact and is above and beyond government, a theological commitment to doing nothing on the assumption that the economy cannot fail. A neoclassical idea that has classical roots going back to Adam Smith and David Ricardo. That is one thing. And out of this, I would worry most about the way in which debt is being created. Not so much the public debt, that probably is manageable, but the way in which we are creating a debt to other countries which, withdrawn, could have a devastating effect sometime on the dollar. The way in which we're massing the debts of private corporations in this takeover movement, which could have a very depressant effect if we had some downturn in economic activity. Same thing that is now true in agriculture. And the effect of the debt structure, which we already see as regards the Latin American loans. All of this could one day lead to, as I say, a loss of confidence in the dollar, a rush to withdraw funds from the United States. And that is the picture which would worry me most about the policies of the present administration. And this would be the situation that would save the Democrats, not any original mental exercise that produces an alternative. That isn't going to happen. I've been a Democrat all my life, but I think I can honestly say that the collegial efforts of the Democratic Party at wisdom to create great and wise courses of action is not appreciably higher than that of the Republicans.
One final question. What would you like in your work to be most remembered for? What contribution, either to ideas or to action, would you like to?
Well, that's an appropriate question for an economist of mature years. I have to confess to my age when you ask me that question. I suppose that I would, in economics, most likely like to be remembered, and most plausibly I will be remembered, for bringing emphasis to an economic structure in which the characteristic organization is the great corporation rather than the competitive enterprise, and of seeing economic life as a bipolar phenomenon, by which I mean seeing it as one structure on the one hand of a few hundred great corporations, and seeing it on the other hand as the residual structure of agriculture, small business, the services, and arguing that controlling economic behavior in the two parts is by no means the same, has to be examined separately. I would hope that there might be some minor effect from that.
Professor Galbraith, on that note, thank you very much for coming back to Berkeley, for participating in this interview and sharing your views with us. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with John Kenneth Galbraith, Cal's 1986 Alumnus of the Year.